Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Horror Stories. I know many of you use these episodes to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Story 1. There's something I need you to understand before I tell you what happened that night in October. I'm a rational person. I've always been. I work as a dental hygienist. I keep my bills up to date, and I don't believe in conspiracy theories, ghosts, or anything like that. But what happened in my house was completely real, and the police reports can confirm every detail. My son Jaime and I had been living in an old farmhouse on Willow Creek Road for about 8 months, just the two of us, after my ex-husband moved to Colorado. The house was perfect for what I could afford. 2 stories, peeling white paint on the wooden walls, and surrounded by cornfields that seemed endless. The loneliness didn't bother me. After years of arguments and shouting, the silence felt almost therapeutic. Jaime was 6 years old, had just started first grade, and he loved having so much space to run around after school. The changes in the house started so subtly that I'm embarrassed by how long it took me to realize what was happening. During the first week of October, I came home from work and found one of the kitchen chairs completely turned around, with its back to the table. It wasn't that Jaime had moved it to climb on something. It was as if someone had deliberately placed it that way. While I made spaghetti, I asked him if it had been him, and he just shrugged. He said he'd been at school all day, which was true. Mrs. Foster had kept him after class for a reading group until I picked him up at 4. Then came the basement door. I'm obsessive about keeping it locked because the stairs are steep and have no railing. But that week I found it open 3 times. Not all the way, just cracked about 15 centimeters, enough to see the darkness beyond. What really made me nervous was the bathroom window. It's a small window on the ground floor that had been painted shut and sealed when we moved in. I spent an entire Saturday with a putty knife and WD-40 trying to open it because the bathroom needed ventilation. After all that effort, I always made sure to latch it properly. The latch was tricky. You had to press hard while sliding it to the right. But that Friday when I got home, I found it open about 10 centimeters. The white lace curtain my mother had given me was being sucked outward, fluttering as if something wanted to escape. Jaime had been at his friend Tommy's house that afternoon. I stood there staring at the window for about 5 minutes, trying to remember if I'd opened it that morning and forgotten. But I knew I hadn't. It had been cold all week, every dawn. The grass was frosted over. I started doing things I'd never done before, checking every lock twice before going to sleep, walking through the rooms with my phone flashlight even though the lights worked perfectly, leaving Jaime's baseball bat next to my nightstand. I even called Mr. Garrett, our neighbor at the end of the road, to ask if he'd seen anyone lurking around my property. He said no, but he mentioned something that chilled my blood. 2 weeks earlier, he'd seen an old green truck parked at the end of my driveway around midday. It stayed there about 20 minutes before leaving. He thought it was someone lost, looking at their phone to find directions. What was unsettling was that I had also seen that same truck, or one just like it, at the town gas station when I stopped to buy milk. The driver was inside, with a baseball cap pulled down to his eyes, watching people come and go. Saturday night was when I knew, without the slightest doubt, that someone had been inside my house. Jaime and I had gone to the town's fall festival and got back around 8:30 at night. He was exhausted, his face covered in paint, hugging a little bag of candy corn he'd won at the ring toss game. While he showered, I went to the kitchen to make him warm milk with honey, a habit I inherited from my grandmother. And that's when I saw it, the drawer where I kept miscellaneous items, my famous junk drawer, was open about 5 centimeters. It wouldn't have mattered if it weren't for the fact that I'm extremely particular about that drawer. I kept the spare house key there, and I always hid it under an old phone book. This time, everything inside looked disturbed, though not messy. It was as if someone had carefully moved things around. The key was still there, but now it was sitting on top of everything, perfectly visible, and not where I'd left it. The small canister of pepper spray I kept in the back corner had been moved to the front, and its cap had been unscrewed. I didn't sleep at all that night. When Jaime went to bed, I wedged my bedroom door shut with a chair and stayed by the window, watching the driveway. Around 2 a.m, I saw a pair of headlights slow down in front of my mailbox and then keep going. It could have been anyone, but my whole body was tense, alert to any sound out of place. The next morning, Sunday, I found something that forced me to call the police for the first time. Under Jaime's bedroom window, there were 5 cigarette butts, all the same kind, Marlboro Reds, with the filter torn off in the exact same way. They were fresh, probably from the night before while we were at the festival. Officer Daniels came, took photos, and wrote everything down, but he explained that without signs of forced entry, there wasn't much they could do. He recommended installing cameras or getting a dog. I couldn't afford cameras, and the landlord didn't allow pets. Monday passed without incident, which, paradoxically, made me even more nervous. I decided not to send Jaime to school, told them he had a stomach ache. We spent the day in the living room watching cartoons, me pretending to fold laundry while constantly watching the windows. I had already decided we would stay a few days at my sister's house in Indianapolis until I figured out what to do. But she couldn't come get us until Wednesday because of work, and I didn't have money to rent a car. Tuesday morning, I took Jaime to school as usual. I couldn't miss another day of work without risking my job. I spent the whole day at the dental office checking my phone over and over, waiting for something. I didn't know what exactly. Dr. Morrison noticed I was on edge. He asked if everything was okay. I just nodded, focused on cleaning the instruments and following the familiar routines of disinfection and inventory, trying to calm my mind. But that Tuesday afternoon is burned into my memory with a clarity that, even now, 2 years later, turns my stomach. I picked Jaime up from after-school care at 4:30, and we stopped at McDonald's for dinner. I couldn't stand the idea of cooking in that kitchen full of windows. We got home just as the sun was starting to set. That golden October light, which used to make the cornfields look beautiful, only served to remind me how alone we were. Jaime ran upstairs to play with his Legos, and I stayed at the kitchen table, scrolling through apartment listings on my phone, trying to calculate whether I could break the lease. Around 7:30, I went upstairs to get the bath ready for Jaime. The bathroom was at the end of the hallway, and as I passed the guest bedroom, I noticed the door was open. That wasn't strange in itself, except that I remembered perfectly well closing it that morning. I had hidden Jaime's birthday gifts in there. When I pushed the door open fully, I felt my heart start pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The window was open, and the screen had been removed, leaning against the inside wall. I grabbed Jaime from his room and told him we were going to play a game where we had to stay very quiet. His eyes went wide, but he nodded without asking questions, trusting me completely. We went down the stairs slowly, and I reached my hand toward the kitchen counter to grab my phone and call 911. That was when I heard it. The living room floorboards creaked with that particular sound they always made when you stepped on the third one from the wall. The noise was slow, deliberate, as if someone were testing their weight, making sure not to make too much sound. I had the phone in my hand, but when I looked at the screen, there was no signal, 0 bars. even though reception in that area was never good. In the kitchen, I always had at least one bar. I tried the landline, that old beige phone that already came with the house. Nothing. Dead. No tone, no hum, no life. The cable was still connected to the wall, but someone had tampered with it. They had cut it at some point I couldn't see. Jaime pressed against my leg, and I could feel his body trembling. The living room was between us and the front door, and the back door was in the laundry room, but the lock on that door had been broken since we moved in. I kept it closed only with a piece of wood wedged in place. Another creak came from the living room, this time closer, and then a sound that froze my blood. A man clearing his throat. He wasn't even trying to hide. He knew we were there. He knew that we knew he was there. I pushed Jaime behind me and grabbed the biggest knife from the wooden block on the counter, the one I used to cut watermelons. My hand was steady, which surprised me. All the fear that had built up over the week vanished, replaced by a cold, instinctive focus. I had one priority: get my son out of that house. The footsteps began moving toward the kitchen, heavy boots on the wooden floor, no longer trying to hide. I made a decision in a fraction of a second. The laundry room and the back door were our only chance. I squeezed Jaime's hand and we ran, yanking out the wooden bar and pushing the door outward, bursting into the freezing air of an October night. Behind us, I heard the man curse, and then his footsteps hurry, but we were already running across the backyard toward the cornfield. Jaime was crying, but he didn't stop. His little legs moved with all the strength he had. The corn had already been harvested, so only the cut stalks and hard earth remained, nowhere to hide. But in the distance, we could see the lights on at Mr. Garrett's house. I scooped Jaime up in my arms and ran like I never had in my life. My bare feet slipped on the icy ground, the knife still in my other hand. I could hear the man's steps behind us, though slower, perhaps surprised that we had escaped. I pounded on Mr. Garrett's door screaming, and thank God he was home. Thank God Penny had a shotgun. And thank God he believed us instantly. He stood in the doorway with the gun while he called the police. They arrested him 40 minutes later, trying to hitchhike on Route 47. His name was Bradley Morris, 38 years old, newly released from prison after serving 5 years for aggravated stalking and attempted kidnapping. He lived in his green truck, the same one we had seen, and he had been watching us for almost a month. Officers found several notebooks in his vehicle filled with notes, our schedules, drawings of the house layout, even descriptions of what Jaime wore to school. He had been coming in when we weren't there, learning our routine, waiting for the right moment. The prosecutor explained that morning after I left for work, he had cut the phone line with the intention of trapping us that night. If we hadn't run, if I had tried to hide or reason with him, I won't allow myself to finish that thought. We moved in with my sister the next day. I never went back to that house, not even to pick up our things. She and her husband went for us afterward and packed everything up. Jaime had nightmares for months, but he's better now. We live in a second-floor apartment in the city, with 3 locks on the door and neighbors all around. Sometimes I miss the quiet of the countryside, but I will never live somewhere that isolated again. Never. Story 2. The curious thing about living in a small town is that everyone thinks they're safe. I was 24 years old and worked as a mechanic at the only auto shop in Oakfield, Montana. I'd been renting a small house on Cedar Lane for nearly 2 years, right where the neighborhood ended and the woods began. My closest neighbor, Mr. Hawkins, lived about 400 meters away. He was a kind old man who ran the town hardware store. I chose that house precisely because of its location. After spending all day dealing with customers and their broken-down trucks, I liked coming back to a quiet place, with no noise and no visitors. It was a Wednesday in early November. I got home around 7, after fighting for hours with the transmission of an especially stubborn Ford F-150. I ate leftover pizza, watched a little TV, and fell into a deep sleep around 11. My bedroom was at the back of the house, facing the woods. I always slept with the window slightly open. I loved the cold air and the whisper of the wind through the pines. I woke up to a sound that didn't fit. It wasn't loud or sudden, and that made it worse. It was a metallic click, slow and calculated, metal against metal, coming from the direction of the kitchen. Half asleep, my brain tried to give it a logical explanation. Maybe the heater had turned on, or the refrigerator was making that weird noise again, like it sometimes did. But then I heard the doorknob turn, slowly, with control, followed by a faint creak of hinges. The back door was opening. The digital clock on my nightstand read 2:47 a.m. in those red numbers that seemed to scream. I remember thinking how strange it was that I could see them so clearly, while my heart was pounding so hard it almost blurred my vision. Someone was inside my house. They weren't forcing entry. They were already in. They moved through my kitchen with a confidence that dried my throat. For an instant, I tried to convince myself it was Mr. Hawkins. He had a copy of my key from when I got a bad flu last winter, and he came to bring me soup and medicine. Maybe something had happened, I thought. Maybe a fire and an emergency. But no, Hawkins would have called first, or at least knocked on the door, and he definitely wouldn't be creeping around at 3 in the morning. Then I saw the light, a thin white line cutting through the darkness of the hallway, moving left to right, as if whoever held it were checking room by room. That's when I heard footsteps. There were 2. My bedroom door was barely cracked open, and through that slit I could see the flashlight beam approaching, accompanied by the soft drag of boots over the wooden floor. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They knew exactly where they were going. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but my fingers felt like lead, clumsy with panic. The screen seemed unbearably bright, and as I tried to dial 911, I heard them talking. "Check the back room first," said a deep voice, rough, emotionless. It wasn't anyone from town. I knew immediately. It had a flat tone, almost mechanical, that tightened my chest. They were already about 3 meters from my door. I could hear them breathing, hear the rustle of leather, gloves or jackets. I don't know. Then I saw them. 2 figures in black ski masks, both holding flashlights, moving with practiced precision, as if they'd done it many times before. The taller one had something in his other hand that caught the light. It could have been a knife, or something worse, but I wasn't going to stay to find out. My window was still slightly open from earlier, and I knew I had only a few seconds before they pushed my bedroom door open. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, staying low, and grabbed the baseball bat I always kept leaning against the dresser, a leftover from my high school days that I'd never bothered to put away. Blessed laziness. The window was the old kind that lifts upward, and I pushed it carefully, holding my breath each time it squeaked. The screen came out more easily than I expected, falling into the bushes with a soft rustle. I could already hear the doorknob turning. I didn't think twice. I swung one leg over the sill and jumped the nearly 3 meters down to the ground, landing hard on the wet leaves. My ankle twisted. A sharp pain shot up my leg, but adrenaline took over. I was running before I realized I was outside, barefoot, wearing only sweatpants and an old Metallica t-shirt. The icy November air hit me like a wall. Behind me, I heard shouting inside the house. They'd found my bed empty. A beam of light shot out through my window, sweeping the backyard, and I flattened myself against the outer wall, trying to control my breathing. The glow passed right where I'd been seconds before. Then I heard the back door slam against the wall and the thunder of boots on the wooden porch. He went out the window. One of them shouted. His voice had a tone that chilled me more than the cold, a mix of calm and amusement. Surround him. He couldn't have gotten far. And in that instant, I understood. They weren't scared. They weren't running, hesitating, or arguing about what to do. Everything was part of a plan. They had even prepared for the scenario where I escaped, which meant they had been watching me. They knew my schedule, knew I lived alone, and that my neighbors were too far away to hear if I screamed. The woods behind my house suddenly became my only possibility. I knew them well. I'd walked those trails many times, even had coffee there on weekends. But running along those paths, barefoot and at night, would be a nightmare. Even so, I had no other choice. I heard one of them move along the left side of the house and the other along the right. They were going to corner me in the yard if I didn't act now. I bolted for the tree line. My feet found every sharp stone and every broken branch in the yard, but I didn't stop. As soon as I crossed into the woods, branches started tearing at my skin and clothes. I couldn't use the main trail. It would be too obvious. So I pushed through the underbrush, trying to remember the exact spot where the old deer path split off from the main road. Behind me, I could hear them closing in. Their flashlights cast grotesque shadows between the trees. They were about 30 meters away, maybe less. They had boots and light. I had only darkness and fear. Then I remembered something. The old hunting stand, half a kilometer into the woods. It belonged to the previous landowner, and almost no one knew it existed. If I could reach it, I could hide and wait for dawn. But as I changed direction, I heard something that froze my soul in a different way. One of them was talking on the phone. "Yeah, he's heading northeast, into the woods," the voice said, as calmly as someone giving directions to a pizza delivery driver. "Have them ready on the access road." "No, we'll flush him out ourselves. Give us 10 minutes. My mind went still. There were more of them. They had accomplices waiting for me on the road that bordered the woods. This wasn't just two men breaking into a house. It was an organized operation. And the target was me. I tried to understand why. I didn't have enemies. I didn't owe money. I didn't know anything important about anyone. I was just a mechanic. And then I remembered. 2 weeks earlier, a guy had brought his car to the shop after closing. He called directly, offered to pay cash, said it was urgent. A black SUV with out-of-state plates. He claimed he'd hit a deer and needed me to repair the damaged chassis. But when I got under the vehicle, I didn't see only impact marks. There was human blood, hair tangled in the metal, and scraps of fabric that looked like clothing. I should have called the police, I know, but the man was right there, watching me work, with a stare so empty it made me go cold. So I fixed it, took the money, and tried to forget it. Except, following shop protocol, I had written down the license plate number on the work order. That document was still in my toolbox. Maybe they had found out. Maybe they thought I had already told someone. One way or another, they were there to tie up loose ends. And that loose end was me. I could hear them getting closer. Their flashlights moved with precision between the trees, advancing calmly, as if they knew I had no escape. My feet were already bleeding, leaving a trail they could follow even without a tracking dog. The hunting stand was still too far away, and with more men waiting on the road, I understood they were hurting me. like prey. Then another idea came to me. The old storm drain that ran through the woods. It was part of the town's flood control system, built in the 1960s. I knew the entrance was nearby, hidden behind a cluster of trees knocked down by the spring storm. It was a narrow, dark tunnel and surely full of filth, but it emptied out near the elementary school on the other side of town. There was no other option. I changed direction and began moving more quietly, using the wind to cover my footsteps. The access point was exactly where I remembered. A concrete opening a little over a meter tall, half covered by dry branches and leaves. The metal grate that should have protected it had disappeared years ago, rusted and eaten away by time. I could hear the murmur of water inside, probably from the runoff of recent rains. Without thinking twice, I dropped to my knees and went headfirst into the tunnel. Icy water covered my ankles and stole the air from my lungs. The concrete was coated in a slimy layer, algae or something worse, and the smell was a mix of sour dampness, dead leaves, and something rotten that had been there a long time. I kept moving forward, feeling my way along, not wanting to imagine what my hands were brushing against. After a few seconds, the tunnel became absolute black. I couldn't see anything, only the echo of my own breathing and the splash of water. Then I heard muffled voices behind me at the entrance. "The blood trail goes up to here," someone said. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, lighting only a few meters before the bend in the tunnel stopped it. He went into the drain. What? No way I'm going in there. There was a brief silence. Then another voice answered. "Call the others. Have them watch the exit by the school. We'll wait here." They thought they had me cornered. What they didn't know was that farther ahead, about 200 meters in, there was a maintenance junction where the tunnel split into three. I kept crawling, my knees scraped raw by the rough concrete, the water rising little by little. Something brushed my leg, probably a rat, and I had to bite my lip so I wouldn't scream. Every meter felt eternal. Finally, the darkness changed. In the distance, the space opened a little wider, the point where the tunnels branched. I turned into the left branch, almost sure it led toward Main Street and not toward the school. Let them wait there. That tunnel was older, narrower, and in several stretches the tree roots had broken through the concrete. I had to move by dragging myself on my stomach. With the water now almost up to my chin, I could barely breathe, but I kept going. After what felt like an eternity, though maybe it was only 20 minutes, I saw light, a storm grate above, with a street lamp shining directly overhead. I could hear the distant sound of cars passing. I gathered the last strength I had and shoved the grate with my shoulder. To my surprise, it gave way. I pushed it aside and hauled myself up, surfacing into open air. I must have looked like a creature out of a horror movie, soaked, covered in mud and blood, with my clothes torn to shreds. A car nearly hit me, swerving sharply to avoid me and blaring its horn. I stumbled to the 24-hour gas station on the corner. The night shift kid looked at me once before reaching for the phone. Within minutes, I was surrounded by police, wrapped in a thermal blanket inside an ambulance, trying to explain through sobs and shivers what had happened. The police searched my house and found it empty. The back door was still open, with bloodstains on the floor, mined from my feet, but the men were gone. However, a few hours later, around 3 a.m, they located a burning SUV abandoned in a field near Highway 18. The plate matched exactly the one I had written down on the shop work order. The vehicle had been reported stolen in Nevada 2 months earlier. They never managed to catch the men who broke into my house that night. Even so, the detective assigned to my case a woman named Reeves, believed every word of my story. She said that in the charred remains of the SUV they found evidence of a hit-and run, like the one I described, including DNA that matched a missing person from Reno. She was the one who arranged my entry into the witness protection program. She helped me move to another state, with a new identity and a completely different life. She told me I'd done the right thing, survive, that my testimony, when the time came, could help solve several cases if they ever caught that organization. That was 3 years ago now. I'm still a mechanic, but now I work in a big city where nobody knows anybody, and that's how I like it. I live in a building with a security guard and cameras in every hallway. I don't work late anymore. I don't accept cash jobs. And of course, I never touch cars with suspicious damage again. Every so often, an FBI agent comes to see me. She tells me the investigation continues, that the group those men belong to is bigger than it seemed. Sometimes she shows me photographs, asking if I recognize any faces. I never recognize anyone. But even today, when I lie down at night, I still listen closely to the sounds of the house. I hope I don't hear anything out of place. The click of metal, the slow turn of a knob, the creak of a step where it shouldn't be. They say I'm safe now, that those men no longer have reasons to look for me. My testimony is recorded, my new identity protected. But sometimes I wonder if that's really true, because there's something that never fully goes away. That feeling that someone, somewhere, is still watching you. And if I learned anything from that night, it's this. Predators who hunt in groups are patient, and they never forget. Story 3. I never imagined I would set foot in Pinewood, Arkansas again, much less in August 2022, 15 years after swearing I would never return. And yet, there I was, driving past the weathered sign that read Population 8,000, with my press credentials in the glove compartment and 17 theft reports scattered across the passenger seat. My editor at the Chicago Tribune had been following the story through the news wires. Elderly people robbed in broad daylight, with no signs of forced entry and an identical pattern in every case. Local police claimed to be baffled, or at least that's what they told the media before coverage mysteriously disappeared after the 10th incident. There was something about all of it that smelled worse than the old paper mill operating on the south side of town. And my editor figured a local connection might open doors that would stay closed to any other outsider reporter. I arrived at the Sunset Lodge around 4 in the afternoon. The August heat made the whole horizon shimmer like a mirage. The place looked exactly the way I remembered it. Peeling paint, the old neon sign half dead, and the same cracked parking lot where teenagers used to drink beer and make bad decisions. Mrs. Colbert was still working the front desk. Her hair, once dyed blonde, was completely gray, and the cigarette she used to hold between her fingers had been replaced by one of those electronic devices that made her look like she was smoking a pen. She recognized me before I even finished signing the register, narrowing her eyes behind those thick glasses she'd worn since the Clinton era. Well, Tommy's boy comes home," she said, sliding the key to room 12 toward me across the counter. "I heard you've been snooping around about those thefts. Let me give you some free advice. Sheriff Brennan doesn't like strangers asking questions. And to him, you're still a stranger from the day you left." My first stop the next morning was the home of Mrs. Eleanor Hutchinson on Dogwood Street, victim number 14, according to my notes. She lived in one of those 1960s ranch-style houses with ceramic garden gnomes out front and a doormat that said, "Bless this mess." She invited me in and offered sweet tea. Her hands trembled a little as she poured. though I couldn't tell whether it was age or nerves. The living room smelled like a mix of potpourri and cat litter, and she had to move a huge orange cat to make room for me on the couch. They took my mother's pearl necklace, she told me, wiping tears with a handkerchief she pulled from her sleeve, and about $300 I kept in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator. But the strangest thing was that they knew exactly where to look. They didn't touch anything else. They didn't make a mess. Nothing. As if they'd been here before. As if they knew where to look. I asked how the police response had been, and her demeanor changed instantly. She glanced toward the window, lowered her voice, and leaned toward me, making the leather of the recliner creak. "Sheriff Brennan showed up almost 2 hours after I called," she whispered, "and the station is 10 minutes away." When he finally arrived, he barely looked around. He took some notes and said they would investigate. But what really froze my blood was something else. He already knew about the coffee can. I hadn't even mentioned it yet. I was still talking about the jewelry. He tried to play it off, saying, "All older folks hide money in the kitchen." But I saw the look in his eyes. The same look my late husband had when I caught him lying about his poker games. Over the next 3 days, I interviewed 6 more victims, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every single one of them mentioned the same thing. Sheriff Brennan took between an hour and a half and 2 hours to arrive after the calls. Even though Pinewood is so small, you can drive across it in 12 minutes. Mrs. Gladys Newcomb, who lived on Elm Street, told me that after waiting more than an hour, she decided to drive to the station herself. When she got there, she saw Brennan's patrol car parked behind the building, while the deputy at the counter swore the sheriff was responding to a call outside town. Mr. Arnold Fishman told me something even more disturbing. When Brennan finally showed up at his house, he had fresh mud on his boots, a kind of reddish clay found only in the woods behind the old Hutchkins property, far from the place where he claimed he'd been handling a traffic accident. But the conversation that unsettled me most was with Walter Briggs, a Vietnam veteran who lived alone in a duplex by the train tracks. He greeted me in his living room with a wrinkled notebook in his hands. He'd been tracking every theft, marking them on a calendar with big red X's. "See anything strange?" he asked, pointing at the dates with a trembling finger. And then I saw it. Every theft had happened on days when Brennan was patrolling alone. No partner, no witnesses. That same night, I decided to have dinner at Murphy's Diner, hoping to overhear some local gossip about the thefts. The place was just like it had been in my teens. Cracked vinyl booths, fluorescent lights that flickered non-stop, and coffee so strong it could strip paint off a wall. I was halfway through my meatloaf when Carl Dobson slid into the booth across from me. Carl had been 2 years ahead of me in high school, still wore his class ring, and now worked at the town hardware store. He didn't bother saying hello. He just leaned forward and spoke in a whisper so low I had to lean in to hear him over the old air conditioner rattling in the window. "You need to leave town," he said, glancing toward the door every few seconds. "Pack your things and go back to Chicago tonight. You're stirring up things that have been buried a long time. Brennan has connections, people who owe him favors going back decades." He paused and lowered his voice even more. "My brother-in-law tried to run against him for sheriff in 2016. He started asking questions about evidence that went missing from the police locker. 2 weeks later, his house burned down. They said it was an electrical issue. He got the message and dropped out of the race. I didn't leave that night, which was probably the dumbest decision of my life. And I've made a lot of bad decisions. Instead, I went back to my motel room and spread all my notes out on the bed, trying to connect the dots. The thefts, the delays, the fact that Brennan always worked alone on the days of the incidents. Everything pointed to him. but I needed stronger proof than coincidences and mud on boots. Around 11, I heard an engine outside, the unmistakable purr of a Ford Crown Victoria, that classic police car sound. I peeked through the curtain just a little, and there it was. Brennan's patrol car parked across the street, lights off, but engine running. I could make out a silhouette in the driver's seat and, every so often, the orange glow of a cigarette lighting up his face. He stayed there 45 minutes, not moving, not getting out, just watching my room. The next morning, I woke up with a gut feeling that something was wrong. I went out to the motel parking lot and confirmed it immediately. One of the rear tires on my rental car had been slashed, a clean cut, too precise to be a nail or road debris. I went straight to the front desk. Mrs. Culber, who had been so talkative the day before, now avoided my eyes. I asked if she had seen anything strange the night before, if she'd noticed the patrol car in front of my room. She just shrugged, pretending she didn't remember anything. The woman who used to know every piece of town gossip suddenly hadn't seen or heard a thing. I tried to get a replacement tire at the local shop. The mechanic took one look at my Michigan plates and, without hesitation, said he wouldn't have the right model in stock for at least 3 or 4 days. Perfect. I was trapped in Pinewood, and it seemed like the whole town knew it. That afternoon, I walked to the public library to use one of their computers, since the motel Wi-Fi had mysteriously stopped working. I had barely logged into my email to send a report to my editor when Betty Garrison, the longtime librarian, the same one who used to watch me check out Hardy Boys books when I was a kid, approached me with a tense expression. "Tom, I don't want to alarm you," she whispered, leaning in, "but Sheriff Brennan just walked in." I turned my head, and there he was, by the magazine section, pretending to read a newspaper, but with his eyes fixed on me. He was even bulkier than I remembered, arms like hams, his duty belt sinking under the weight of his belly. When he realized I'd seen him, he folded the paper calmly and walked over to my table. He sat down without asking permission. "I heard you've been talking to people," he said with a fake smile and a voice that tried to sound friendly, but eyes cold as steel. He pulled out a can of chewing tobacco, flicked the rim with his thumb, and tucked a wad into his lower lip before continuing. "You see, in small towns people get confused sometimes, especially the elderly. They forget things, mix up dates, connect dots that aren't there. Mrs. Hutchinson, for example, good woman, but she's been taking anxiety pills since her husband died. That makes her a little paranoid. And Walter Briggs, well, that man sees conspiracies ever since he came back from Vietnam. You can't believe everything people tell you." He leaned back in the chair, which creaked under his weight, and I noticed his hand resting on his service pistol. Not overtly threatening, but enough to make sure I saw it. "Look, I know you're just doing your job, writing your little article for that Chicago paper," he continued with a sneer. "But sometimes stories aren't what they seem. Sometimes it's just a couple of thefts by some passing junkie, and a sheriff's department doing what it can with limited resources. Nothing more interesting than that." I took a deep breath, and I made my second big mistake of the week. I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo, Walter Briggs's calendar, with all the theft dates marked in red. "Interesting," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "How that passing junkie only works on the days you patrol alone, and also how you're always on the other side of town when the victims call." His jaw tightened. Color rose from his neck until it stained his whole face, like wine spilling over a white tablecloth. Suddenly he stood up so fast the chair toppled backward. and for a second I thought he was going to yank me out of my seat or hit me right there. Instead, he leaned in close, so close I could smell the mix of tobacco and stale coffee on his breath. "You have no idea what you're getting into, kid," he murmured, with a soulless smile. "This isn't Chicago. Out here, reporters sometimes have accidents. Cars go off the road on a dark night, or someone falls down the stairs at that old motel. It's happened before. Ask Jimmy Watts." "Oh, right, you can't. His car ended up in Lake Buchanan in 2014, after he started asking questions he shouldn't have. Tragic accident. They said brakes can fail on those rural roads." He straightened up, adjusted the belt where his gun hung, and gave me a broad smile without a hint of warmth. "Have a nice day, son, and think about heading home early tomorrow, before something unfortunate happens to you." I left the library with my legs shaking like jelly, but even though I knew I should leave, I still wasn't finished. That night, instead of following the sheriff's suggestion and running out of town, I made a different decision. I wasn't going to let them silence me. So I drove my rental car, now with the spare tire installed, to the old abandoned Texaco, parked it behind the building, and walked back to the motel through the trees, unseen. Once in my room, I turned off all the lights and hid in the bathroom, leaving the door slightly ajar so I could see the window's reflection. I waited, my heart hammering, and just as I expected, around midnight, I heard the familiar purr of a patrol car stopping in front of the motel. It was Brennan. This time he didn't stay in the car. I watched him get out, walking with a steady stride, and in his hand something metallic gleamed. A thin tool, maybe a Slim Jim hook or a set of lockpicks. He stopped at my door, pressed his ear to the wood, and stayed still for a few seconds. Then he started working the lock. The sound of metal scraping the latch echoed in the quiet night. It took him no more than 30 seconds to open it. He entered carefully, moving slowly. I could hear his steps on the carpet, the faint creak of the bed when he checked on top of it, the click of my laptop powering on. He was looking for my notes, my proof, or maybe making sure I was dead. After a few minutes, I heard him leave. He locked the door behind him, got into his car, and drove away. I waited a full hour before I dared move. When I finally came out, I searched the room with my phone flashlight. Nothing had been taken, but my notebook was in a different place, and my laptop showed an open window I didn't remember leaving that way. He'd been going through my information, trying to figure out how much I knew. At dawn, my decision was made. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I packed my things and drove straight to the state police barracks in Centerville, about 60 kilometers away. Their eyes showed everything: Walter Briggs's calendar with the marked dates, the victim's statements, the account of the attempted break-in in my room. The lieutenant in charge listened carefully and, in the end, nodded. He told me it wasn't the first time they'd received complaints about Brennan, but until then they'd never had enough proof. Now, with what I was handing over and they could open a formal investigation. That same afternoon, they put me up in a hotel in Centerville for safety and sent a team to Pinewood. In less than a week, the case blew wide open. They discovered Sheriff Brennan had been behind the thefts the whole time. He used his position to check on elderly residents' homes during supposed wellness visits, watched where they kept money or jewelry, and then came back when he knew they'd be at church or the doctor. He had stolen more than $200,000 in 2 years. The FBI got involved after discovering he'd sold stolen items out of state, which kicked the case up to the federal level. The last I heard, he was facing between 15 and 20 years in prison. What still turns my stomach is knowing the whole town suspected him, but no one dared speak. Everyone had seen the signs, but fear weighed more than the truth. It took an outsider, someone who once called Pinewood home, to expose what everyone pretended not to see. I never went back to that place, but I heard they elected a new sheriff, a woman from Dallas, with no ties to the old regime. Maybe things are different now. Though, to be honest, I don't plan to find out. Small towns have long memories, and I'm not willing to test whether they've forgiven me for toppling their corrupt king. Story 4. About 40 minutes from Riverside, just off Highway 22, there's a diner that was my second home for almost 2 years. I was 23 back then, working double shifts almost every day to save enough money to get into nursing school. It wasn't my dream job, but it paid the bills. The place wasn't anything special. Red vinyl seats patched with silver tape, a jukebox that only played half the songs you chose, and coffee that tasted like burnt rubber if you let it sit too long. Still, the tips were decent, especially from truckers passing through at all hours. And my boss, Frank, was kind enough to let me study during the dead hours between lunch and dinner. That Saturday in early spring, I'd been there since 5 a.m., and my feet were already screaming inside my worn-out sneakers. The breakfast shift had been brutal. 2 tour buses stopped without warning, and I'd barely managed to eat a piece of toast before the lunch crowd started coming in. Around 2:30, when the last customers left, Frank told me to take a real break. I grabbed my jacket and went out the back, where we parked the cars, desperate for a little fresh air and silence. The afternoon sun brushed my face, warm, after spending so many hours under fluorescent lights. I decided to drive to the gas station a little over a kilometer away to buy an energy drink that would help me survive the dinner shift. The road connecting the diner to the gas station was usually empty at that hour. A straight strip of asphalt cutting through barren fields and the occasional cluster of pines. I rolled the windows down and let the cold air mess up my hair. And then I saw her. About 200 meters ahead, a woman was jogging along the right shoulder. She wore a bright neon yellow vest that glowed under the sun, headphones in, and a ponytail bouncing with every stride. She looked completely focused on her run. Suddenly, a huge dark blue Ford F-350 truck with chrome bumpers took the curve at full speed, going at least 70 in a 45 zone. The driver had to be texting or adjusting the radio, because the vehicle drifted onto the shoulder. The impact was instant and brutal. The woman's body flew through the air like a rag doll, landing in the ditch about 10 meters ahead. The truck swerved slightly, regained control, and kept going without braking. It all happened in 3 seconds, but every detail burned into my mind like a photograph. I slammed on the brakes, the squeal of my tires cutting through the silence, and ran toward the ditch while fumbling for my phone with shaking hands. The woman was lying at an impossible angle, her left leg bent backward, blood spreading beneath her head, soaking into the dry grass. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing, and I knew immediately she was already dead. Even so, I dropped to my knees and checked for a pulse, my fingers pressing against her cold neck and finding nothing. I called 911, barely able to get the words out. I told them about the hit and run, described the truck, the color, the chrome bumpers, even the Georgia Bulldog sticker I'd caught a glimpse of in the rear window as it sped away. The operator kept me on the line until the ambulance and 2 patrol cars arrived. I stayed there, in that ditch, time frozen, staring at her face. She looked young, maybe just over 30. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow and a handful of freckles across her nose. The first to arrive was Officer Dunham, a man in his 50s, with a thick gray mustache and a belly hanging over his belt. He took my statement right there on the roadside, while paramedics worked around the body with no hope. I told him everything, the exact time, the vehicle description, the speed, the direction it fled. He nodded without looking at me much, writing with a pen that kept sticking, forcing him to trace over the words twice. But when I mentioned the bulldog sticker, he looked up for the first time, his expression hidden behind aviator sunglasses. "Are you sure about that sticker?" he asked. I told him yes, completely sure. He wrote something else and told me I'd have to come by the station later to file the report formally. He promised they would put out a bolo immediately. I went back to work in a daze, operating on autopilot. I couldn't focus on orders or refilling coffee cups. Frank watched me from the counter, worried, and when he saw me standing in front of a table with my notepad in hand, staring into space while customers waited, he decided to send me home early. That night, around 7, I drove to the Riverside Police Station on the town's main avenue. It was a low brick building that shared a parking lot with the courthouse. At the counter, a woman with bleached hair and extremely long acrylic nails told me to go to the back, to Officer Dunham's desk. I found him clumsily typing on an old computer, using only 2 fingers, focused on the screen as if each letter were a monumental task. He barely looked up when I sat down in front of him. "I just need to put this on the record officially," he said, pulling a form out of the drawer. We went through the statement again, the same questions, the same answers. But this time something was different. His tone was more rushed, mechanical, like he was checking boxes on a list instead of actually listening. When we finished, he asked me to sign at the bottom of the document. And then he did something that left an icy feeling in my chest. He folded the report into quarters, turning it into a small square, and tossed it into his desk drawer, among rubber bands, rusted paper clips, and candy wrappers. He didn't file it, didn't place it in an inbox tray. He just threw it in there like trash. "If we need anything else, we'll call you," he said without looking at me, going back to typing. I sat there for a moment, waiting for him to mention the investigation, to say something about the truck or the dead woman. But no, he just kept tapping those keys slowly, as if I'd already been erased from his mind. I left the station with a heavy feeling in my stomach, like I'd swallowed a stone. Over the next 3 days, I compulsively checked the local news, expecting to see an article, a brief notice, anything about the hit and run on Highway 22. Nothing, not a single mention. I called the station twice. Both times they transferred me around until someone told me Officer Dunham would call me back. He never did. I couldn't stop thinking about that woman's face, her freckles, the scar, the empty eyes. She had to have family, friends, someone who was looking for her. On Wednesday, during my lunch break, I drove back to the accident site. I expected to find flowers, a cross, a sign, something marking the place where she died. But there was nothing. No trace of blood in the grass. The shoulder was clean, as if nothing had ever happened there. Maybe the rain from the past few days had washed it all away, or maybe someone had made sure it was cleaned. Friday afternoon, I went to the bank to deposit my week's tips. I took the back route to avoid traffic, passing right behind the police station. And that's when I saw it. Behind the metal fence where they kept impounded cars and out-of-service patrol vehicles, there was a dark blue Ford F-350 truck parked. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it. I pulled into the McDonald's parking lot next door so I could look more closely through the fence. It was identical. Same chrome bumpers, same shape, same color. And there, in the rear window, the Georgia Bulldog sticker gleamed. My stomach flipped when I noticed the detail that confirmed everything. The front of the vehicle was damaged. A dent in the bumper, a broken headlight, and worst of all, what looked like dried blood and strands of hair caught in the grill. I sat there in my car for about 20 minutes, trying to process it. The truck that had killed that woman was parked behind the police station, in plain sight, and nobody was doing anything. My mind wouldn't stop. Maybe they'd found it and were processing it as evidence, or the owner had turned himself in. But then why wasn't it in the news? Why hadn't Dunham called me? Why had he thrown my report away like it didn't matter? I wanted to go into the station and demand answers, but something stopped me. The way he looked at me when I mentioned the sticker, the tense gesture, the way he folded my statement. Everything took on a sinister meaning. Someone in that station knew exactly who was driving that truck, and they were protecting him. I spent the entire weekend paralyzed with indecision, sleeping badly, with the image of that woman burned into my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the freckles, the scar, the empty eyes staring at the sky. I knew I couldn't stay silent, but I was also afraid of what might happen if I spoke up. Monday morning, I finally made a decision. I drove the 40 minutes to the state police barracks in Millerton. I walked in with everything I had, every detail written down, and the printed photographs I'd taken of the truck behind the impound fence. The agent who took my report was a young man in his 30s, Sergeant Cole. He listened to my story without interrupting once, his expression growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he took the photos and made copies of everything. Then he asked me questions Officer Dunham had never asked. The exact time, whether anyone else had seen the truck, whether anyone had threatened me. He gave me his direct number and promised they would investigate. I left with a mix of relief and fear, not knowing if they would really do anything. 2 weeks later, Sergeant Cole called me. They had opened an investigation not only into the hit and run, but into how the Riverside Police Department had handled the case. The truth started coming out little by little, like pieces of something rotten buried for too long. The truck belonged to Officer Dunham's nephew, a young man named Brandon, with 2 prior DUI charges that had been reduced to simple infractions. The woman who died was named Anna Shelton, a nurse from a nearby town who was training for a marathon the day she was hit. Her family had been given a false story that she'd been struck by an unknown vehicle, and the case was closed for lack of evidence. Dunham was fired. Brandon received 5 years in prison for vehicular manslaughter and leaving the scene, and 3 more officers were suspended for helping cover it up. I had to testify at the trial, facing Dunham, who watched me with a mix of hatred and betrayal, as if I'd broken some unwritten code. But as I spoke to the jury, all I could think about was Anna's family finally knowing the truth about what happened to her. After the trial, I quit the diner. I couldn't keep driving past that stretch of Highway 22 without feeling a knot in my stomach. I moved to Millerton, found work at another restaurant, and finally began my nursing studies. Sometimes I still dream about that afternoon, about the bright sun and the empty road, about the exact moment I saw that truck behind the station. That instant when I understood that the people who are supposed to protect us, sometimes they're the very ones who hide the truth. Story 5. I had been living in that little yellow house for exactly 2 weeks when the Richardsons moved into the house next door. I was 24 years old, working from home as a graphic designer, and I'd chosen that quiet street in a small town in Ohio precisely because nothing ever happened there. Or at least, that's what I thought. My days were routine, waking up at 7, making coffee in a kitchen that was strangely bigger than the living room, sitting at my desk by the window and designing logos for startups that would probably fail within 6 months. The house had its charm, though it was a bit weird. The bathroom door got stuck against the toilet, the bedroom walls showed exposed brick, and the wooden floor creaked with every step. But for $800 a month, I couldn't complain. My landlord, Mr. Hoffman, lived in Florida. And during the only phone conversation we ever had, he made it very clear that as long as the rent arrived on time, I was invisible to him. The Richardsons arrived on a Wednesday at 2 in the morning, which already seemed strange to me, even though I was still awake, working on an urgent project for a client who understood immediate delivery to mean yesterday. From my studio window, I watched their moving truck pull up in front of the house, but there wasn't the usual chaos of a move. No laughter, no voices, no boxes crashing. 4 people got out of the vehicle and started unloading in complete silence. Their movements were so coordinated, so precise, that my skin prickled. There was a teenager with a baseball cap pulled so low it covered his face completely, and a girl, about 12, with hair so blonde it looked white under the streetlights. The parents were ordinary-looking people, the kind you pass at a gas station and forget instantly, except for how they moved in perfect sync, as if they'd rehearsed that choreography 1,000 times, never once bumping into each other. For the next 3 days, I waited for something normal, neighborly to happen, someone mowing the lawn, kids playing in the yard, a casual wave while getting the mail. But none of that happened. The house stayed motionless, with the curtains sealed shut on every window. Not a single visible light, even when night fell. The only sign of life was their beige sedan, which left every morning at exactly 7:15 and returned at 5:45, with a punctuality so perfect I could have set my clock by them. I started noticing details I normally wouldn't have. Their trash bins appeared at the curb at exactly 3 in the morning on pickup days. Packages that delivery drivers dropped off vanished within minutes, even though I never saw the door open. And their lawn stayed identical, about 5 centimeters high, without anyone ever cutting it. My office had a direct view of the second floor of their house, even though the thick burgundy curtains blocked any view inside. I constantly felt eyes on me while I worked. By the second week, that sensation of being watched grew stronger, like invisible hands pressing against my temples every time I sat at my desk. I caught myself turning my head again and again, expecting to see the curtains move, but they didn't. Not even the slightest tremble from air conditioning. One afternoon, while designing a website banner, I decided to test my paranoia. I spun abruptly in my chair, and I swear I saw the curtains snap shut, as if someone had pulled them aside and then immediately let the fabric drop. It was so fast I can't swear it was real, but I felt it. That night I started working with my own blinds closed, trying to calm myself, though the feeling stayed there, crawling over my skin like static electricity. I jumped at every noise. I spilled coffee on my keyboard twice that same day. Everything changed on a Friday in early December. I had to drive to Columbus for a meeting with a client who, like most of them, confused urgent with impossible. The presentation went well, but the CEO insisted on one last revision so many times that I didn't leave the office until after 9. The drive back, about 2 hours, was a fight against sleep. I stayed awake by chugging energy drinks from a gas station and blasting music at full volume, with the windows cracked open despite the cutting cold. It was 11:47 at night when I finally parked in front of my house. I was exhausted, craving a hot shower and a bed. The Richardsons' house was, as always, wrapped in absolute darkness. Still, something looked different. Their car wasn't parked properly. Instead of sitting in its usual spot, it was at an awkward angle, as if someone had left it in a hurry. As I dug for my keys in my bag, fingers numb from the cold, I felt the doorknob turn easily. The door was open. My first thought was that I'd forgotten to lock it that morning. But then I clearly remembered checking it twice, precisely because I'd left my laptop on the kitchen table. I went in cautiously. The house was as silent and dark as when I'd left it, but the air felt different, as if something, or someone, had disturbed the invisible order of the place. I turned on the entryway light, and that's when I saw it. Print after print, stamped in fresh mud, crossed the living room from the front door to the hallway. They were huge boot prints, maybe size 13 or bigger. They didn't look random. They followed a precise path, straight toward my bedroom and my office. The mud was still wet and glistened under the light. I crouched to look closer. Mixed into the dirt were traces of reddish clay, the same kind of mud from the construction site 3 blocks away where they were building new condos. Every instinct screamed at me to run, go back to the car and call the police from far away. But part of me, maybe curiosity or denial, pushed me to follow those prints deeper inside. My phone was already in my hand. 911 dialed but not yet pressed. I moved slowly, my thumb hovering over the call button. The footprint stopped in front of my desk. In my office, the chair on which I normally left angled was turned toward the window, the same one that faced the Richardsons' house. My computer was still there, apparently untouched, but my sketchbook, the one I used for ideas and notes, was open to a blank page. Except it wasn't blank anymore. Someone had drawn there, with my own pencil, a detailed floor plan of my house, every room correctly labeled, and precise notes about things only someone who'd been inside could know. Floorboard creaks here. Bathroom door gets stuck. Coffee maker always on the kitchen table. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting so perfect it looked printed, a sentence froze my blood. You watch us. We watch you. I barely had time to process it when I heard it. Footsteps upstairs, right above my head. The sound was coming from the attic. A space I'd never entered because the hatch had been painted shut and sealed. The ceiling creaked in a slow rhythm, as if someone was pacing back and forth. And then the noise stopped, directly above me. I stood frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs. Then I heard the scraping of the attic hatch, the paint cracking into little pieces, falling like white snow onto the hallway carpet. I didn't wait to see what was coming down. I ran straight out the front door, without looking back. Once in my car, I finally dialed 911 as I started it and drove away from the neighborhood. I tried to explain to the operator what had happened. But how do you explain something like that? How do you tell someone you'd been living with a stranger above your head, watching you every day? The police arrived about 40 minutes after my call. I waited for them in the parking lot of a gas station several kilometers from my house, still shaking, trying to put my words in order so I could explain what I'd seen. When the officers entered the house, they found him. The Richardsons' teenage son, curled up in the attic, wrapped in a sleeping bag among empty food wrappers and 3 notebooks crammed with the notes about my daily routine. He had been there for exactly 2 weeks, the same amount of time I'd felt something was wrong. He'd accessed the attic through a hidden panel behind the clothes in my closet, a compartment I'd never noticed. From there, he'd opened a small hole in the ceiling, perfectly aligned with my office, just enough to watch me through the insulation. The officers told me he came down at night while I slept to use the bathroom and take food from the kitchen. The boy's name was Nathan. He didn't resist when they arrested him. He just sat there with an empty expression, not saying a word, not even when they questioned him. His parents arrived minutes later. They stood in my yard, motionless, without a hint of emotion. The mother was the only one who spoke. She looked at me directly and said, with a calm that chilled me, "He likes to understand how people live." Over the following days, the truth came out in pieces. Through police reports and neighborhood gossip, the Richardsons had moved 7 times in 3 years, always after Nathan became obsessed with someone nearby. The detective assured me he wasn't violent, but he was deeply obsessive. He needed to observe, record, learn people's patterns until he could predict their every move. The family lived in complete darkness, curtains shut, lights off, to keep him calm, minimizing any stimulation. The problem was that when I showed curiosity about them, I became his new subject of study. Police found the same thing in other towns where they'd lived. Hidden cameras in vents, meticulous logs of neighbors' schedules and habits, and even evidence that Nathan had lived inside other people's homes, hidden in attics or basements, without anyone knowing. The detective showed me photographs of the notebooks they recovered. In them, Nathan had written things like, "Subjectize her hair when stressed, Tuesday and Thursday. Drinks coffee at 10:15, checks the window at 3:17 p.m. after break." I couldn't spend another night in that house. I packed what fit in my car and hid out in a motel for 3 days, trying to process the magnitude of the invasion. It wasn't just physical fear. It was the feeling that someone had dissected my life, that they knew every detail about me. They knew when I cried after talking to my ex, which mug I used for coffee and which for tea, even that I sang bad 80s songs while doing laundry on Sundays. The Richardsons disappeared before Nathan's court date. They left the house empty, the rent paid through the end of the month, and vanished, just like they had other times. I broke my lease, accepting the financial loss, and moved into a building with security cameras and a doorman. But for months, I couldn't relax. I checked closets for hidden panels, ran my hand along ceilings looking for tiny holes, afraid someone might be recording my new habits in another notebook. 6 months later, I received a forwarded letter from my old address, with no return address, just my name written in that same perfect handwriting from the message I'd found on my desk. Inside was a single page with one sentence: "You were the most interesting." I took the letter to the police, but they told me that without a postmark or origin address, there was nothing they could do. Since then, I've moved 2 more times, changed jobs, and deleted almost all my social media. Even so, in some nights I wake up in a panic, convinced I hear the ceiling creak above me, even though I live on the top floor now. The detective called me last month. They had arrested Nathan in Michigan, this time living inside the walls of a family home. He had 17 notebooks filled with observations. When they asked him why he did it, he answered with chilling calm, "I'm practicing to be a writer. The best characters come from real people, and she taught me the most about fear." Story 6. The night everything went wrong was a Wednesday in late September 2016. I taught English to sophomores at Riverside High, one of those small-town schools where everyone knows everyone else's business. I had just finished grading a mountain of essays on the Great Gatsby. My wife, Laura, had texted me earlier, asking me to buy milk on my way home. I remember being a little annoyed. The nearest grocery store closed at 9, and it was already past 11. The custodian, old Mr. Hutchkins, had locked up the building hours ago. leaving me alone under the flickering lights of the teacher's lounge. I'd been staying late for weeks, trying to catch up after filling in for Mrs. Coleman, who was out on medical leave. My beat-up Ford truck was the last vehicle in the parking lot. The engine coughed twice before starting, like it did every cold night for the past 3 winters. The drive home took me along County Road 74, a narrow 2-lane road that ran about 25 kilometers through farmland and small patches of woods, until it reached the edge of the town where we lived. Most nights I drove that stretch on autopilot, the windows down, listening to whatever classic rock station I could pick up without interference. But that night, from the moment I left the main road, something felt different. The new moon left everything beyond my headlights wrapped in that kind of dense rural darkness that seems to swallow sound. About 10 kilometers in, just past the old Garrett Ranch, which they'd sold to a developer years earlier, my headlights caught something metallic shining on the side of the road. As I got closer, I made out a dark sedan, maybe a Toyota or a Honda. Hard to tell under that blackness. It was stopped with its hazard lights blinking in that urgent orange rhythm. The car wasn't positioned right, angled awkwardly, as if the driver had swerved sharply to get off the asphalt. My first instinct was to keep driving. We've all heard stories about fake accidents, people pretending to need help so they can trap or rob whoever stops. But then I thought of my daughter, Katie, who was in college. What if she got stranded and nobody stopped to help her? That thought bit at my conscience for barely half a minute before I slowed down and pulled in behind the sedan, leaving about 6 meters of distance and keeping my engine running. I grabbed the Maglite flashlight I always kept under the seat, the same one Laura liked to tease me about, saying it made me look like a cop, and stepped out of the truck. The silence hit me instantly. No traffic, no crickets, no wind, nothing. I called out loud, "Hello? Everything okay?" My voice seemed to dissolve into the darkness. The sedan's interior light was on, and through the rear window I could see the driver's seat was empty. Both front doors were closed, but the driver's door wasn't fully latched, as if someone had gotten out in a hurry and hadn't pushed it shut. I approached cautiously, sweeping the flashlight along both sides of the road. Maybe the driver had gone looking for a signal, or someone had picked them up. When I got close enough, I saw it was a 2014 Nissan Altima with a local plate, one of those with the Port Haven lighthouse on it. I shined the light inside without touching anything. That's when my chest tightened. On the driver's seat was an open wallet, with the card still in place. On the passenger seat, an iPhone face down, the screen still lit with the missed call notifications. A half-full coffee cup in the holder was still giving off a faint thread of steam. The keys were still in the ignition, and the radio murmured a local political talk station at a volume so low it sounded like a whisper. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but the screen read no service. That wasn't unusual on that stretch, where coverage always dropped. The logical thing would have been to drive back until I had reception, but something pushed me to check the area first. I walked around the car, looking for any sign of an accident or a struggle. The grass by the passenger side was flattened in a strange pattern, not like someone had walked there, but like something heavy had been dragged. The trail ran about 3 meters into the field before disappearing where the grass grew taller. I followed it with the flashlight, calling out again, "Hello, is anyone there? I'm here to help." The beam caught something white against the dark soil. A women's running shoe, size 7 or 8, lying on its side, with the laces still tied. My mouth went dry. I picked it up and saw, right beside it, a barefoot footprint perfectly pressed into the mud, as if someone had run off without stopping to retrieve the shoe. I tried to force myself to think rationally. It could be anything. Maybe the driver had a medical episode, a mental break, got disoriented, but nothing fit. Why leave the wallet, the phone, the keys? Why just one shoe? I went back to my truck and grabbed the emergency first aid kit from behind the seat. Back at the Altima, I opened the driver's door using my jacket sleeve so I wouldn't leave fingerprints. The driver's license was right there. Melissa Vaughn, 32 years old, resident of Riverside Heights, about 40 minutes from there. In the photo, she looked tired but kind. In the wallet, there were family pictures, 2 kids in baseball uniforms, a golden retriever, a backyard cookout. Normal things that made my stomach clench. The phone kept buzzing with notifications. Missed calls from Hub and messages like, "Where are you?" The kids are asking about dinner. I shouldn't have touched it, but I needed to get help. I pressed the home button with my knuckles. The screen read 11:47 p.m. and 17 missed calls. The last message, sent 3 minutes earlier, said, "Mel, I'm getting worried. Your location shows you stopped on the county road. Call me, please." That meant her husband knew exactly where the car was. I memorized the numbers so I could call him as soon as I had service. And right then, I heard it. An engine in the distance. The sound was getting closer, cutting through the silence like a knife. The engine grew louder, approaching from the direction of town. On that road, maybe 3 cars passed all night, and it was almost midnight on a Wednesday. I turned toward the lights creeping closer. It was a white van with no rear windows, the kind that looks like maintenance or delivery, moving slowly, no more than 20 kilometers per hour, like the driver was searching for something. When it got close enough to make out my truck and the Altima, it came to a full stop, right in the middle of the road. 10 seconds passed that felt endless. I raised my hand in a friendly gesture, trying to look calm, normal. But the van didn't move. I couldn't see the driver. The high beams blinded me. But I had the unmistakable feeling I was being watched, evaluated, every move measured. Then, without warning, the engine roared. The van accelerated hard, so fast the tires squealed against the asphalt, and it tore past, disappearing into the curves ahead. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw it. Splatters of fresh mud on the van's rear doors, the same dark reddish color as the mud in the field where I'd found the shoe. My mind started connecting dots I didn't want to connect. An abandoned car, a shoe, a drag trail, and a van with freshly thrown mud. I decided I'd seen enough. I ran back to my truck, locked the doors, and started it hard. I kept the high beams on, scanning the roadside, hoping to see some other sign, while deep down, praying I wouldn't. When my phone finally showed 2 bars of service near the old water tower, I pulled over and dialed 911. I explained everything. The abandoned car, then the wallet, the phone, the shoe in the field, the white van. The operator told me to stay there, that a patrol unit was on the way and they needed me to guide them back to the location. While I waited, I dialed the number I'd memorized from Melissa's phone. The man answered on the first ring, his voice shaking. "Mel." I swallowed before replying. I told him who I was, what I'd found, that the police were heading there. When I mentioned the shoe, he made a sound I'll never forget. Not exactly a sob, more like the air leaving his body all at once. He kept asking, desperate, "Was there blood? Did you see blood?" I told him the truth. No, there wasn't. But that answer didn't seem to comfort him. 20 minutes later, 2 deputy sheriffs arrived where I was waiting. I turned on my hazard lights and guided them back to the spot. Only when we got there, the car was gone. Where there had been a Nissan Altima with flashing hazards the night before, there was nothing. No tire marks, no flattened grass where I'd walked, not even the shoe I'd left on the hood. The deputies looked at me with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion. One of them asked if I was sure this was the place. I was. I knew that stretch of road like the back of my hand, right after the Whitman property, with that crooked fence post as the landmark. Still, they searched the area with their flashlights while I insisted this was the exact location. The younger one radioed in to confirm my report. The other, instead, crouched by the ditch and found something. A single tire track, pressed into fresh mud, as if a heavy vehicle had been there recently. But that was all. There was no evidence of the car, no woman, nothing of what I described. They took my statement, wrote down the details in a notebook, and I could see in their faces they didn't fully believe me. They said they'd checked the Vaughn family records, and the plate number I remembered, though their tone was the kind you use to calm a nervous witness, not follow a real lead. I drove home in a state of total shock. It was almost 2 in the morning when I opened the front door. Laura was asleep on the couch, the TV on. I didn't wake her. I just poured myself a beer and sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of the impossible. The next morning I woke up without having really slept. My head was full of images. The shoe, the empty car, the blinking lights in the dark. I called the school and said I was sick, something I never did, and decided to go back to County Road 74. The sun changed everything. In broad daylight, the place looked completely normal, just a stretch of road between open fields and scattered trees. Still, I pulled over and got out. I searched the grass for the exact spot where I'd seen the shoe, the flattened tracks, the muddy trail, but there was nothing. Not a mark. Not even disturbed ground. It was as if someone had smoothed the earth overnight. I drove to the sheriff's department in town. The desk officer, a young man with a bored look, checked the system. There was no missing person report for anyone named Melissa Vaughn. There was also no record of an abandoned vehicle, or of any call other than mine the night before. I stared at the counter, speechless, trying to understand. I left with the feeling that I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. That afternoon, driven by something I can't explain, I drove to Riverside Heights, the address I'd read on Melissa's driver's license. It was a modest 2-story house, with a rusted basketball hoop over the garage and toys scattered in the yard. In the yard, 2 kids were playing with a ball. They were the same ones I'd seen in the photos in the wallet. My hand started shaking. I rang the doorbell. A woman opened the door. It wasn't Melissa, not even remotely similar. I carefully explained that I was looking for a woman named Melissa Vaughn, that I thought I might have found something of hers. She looked at me without understanding. "No one by that name lives here," she said calmly. "My husband and I have been renting this house for 5 years." The kids ran up to her and called her Mom. Her expression was sincere, confused. I apologized for bothering her and turned away. I was just about to get into my truck when I felt someone tug my sleeve. It was one of the kids, about 8 years old. He spoke softly, almost a whisper. "She told us not to talk to the lady who came yesterday asking about our house. Are you with her?" I crouched down, trying to keep my voice steady. "What lady?" But before he could answer, his mother called from the doorway, her tone tense. "Get inside now." The boy backed away and disappeared into the house. I heard the click of the deadbolt locking behind them. I stood there for a moment on the sidewalk, not knowing what to do or what to believe. Then I got into my truck and drove away slowly. 3 years have passed since that night. I still take County Road 74 to get home after work, and even though I've never seen anything strange again, I always slow down when I pass that stretch. I can't help it. Looking for, without wanting to admit it, the distant blink of hazard lights that are no longer there. Story 7. I remember that night clearly because, in theory, it was supposed to be something simple, almost comforting. Our small town didn't usually have big events, so the annual fair was one of the few moments everyone looked forward to with real excitement. I went after work, still in my uniform, mostly just to eat a sugar cake and walk around a bit under the hanging lights. I wasn't there long, maybe an hour, before heading back to my car. I'd parked it on a side street, a block from the main lot where most people gathered. When I got there, I noticed the windshield looked strange under the streetlight. There was a folded piece of paper tucked under the wiper. I thought it was going to be some church flyer or a promotion from a local business. I didn't think much of it until I sat in the driver's seat, set it aside, and opened it. It wasn't an ad or any kind of flyer. It was just a handwritten list, in big square letters, perfectly organized. Each line showed a date and a time, as if someone had copied a calendar or a schedule log. At first, I didn't understand. I thought it was some lost schedule that had ended up in my car by mistake, until I saw my work shift from 2 nights earlier, with the exact time I'd gotten off. I kept reading and my chest went cold. Every day that week was there, with the times I'd arrived at work and left work. Then I understood. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been following me, recording my movements with precision. At the bottom of the page, in slightly larger letters, there was a short message. "See you soon." In that moment, all the warmth of the fair collapsed inside me. I'd spent the evening walking among strangers, standing in line to buy sweets, laughing with music in the background. And at some point, someone who knew exactly my schedule had gotten close enough to leave that note on my car. I felt brutally exposed, as if my own routine no longer belonged to me. I sat there with the engine off, reading that sheet over and over. My first reaction was to look around, at the sidewalk, at the people heading back from the event. No one seemed to be watching me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever wrote it was still nearby, waiting to see my reaction. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried an invisible weight. I drove home and barely remembered the trip. Every pair of taillights felt like it was following me, and I checked the rear-view mirror more than the road. The paper stayed on the passenger seat. I couldn't throw it away or tear it up. Part of me wanted to keep it as proof, in case I ever needed it. Another part of me hated having it so close, as if it were an invisible thread keeping me connected to whoever left it. When I got to my apartment, I turned on my desk lamp and looked at the sheet again. The handwriting wasn't sloppy, but it wasn't elegant either. It had a strange regularity, almost mechanical, as if the person had written with deliberate calm. The dates and times matched my shifts for the entire week perfectly. It even listed the day I'd swap shifts at the last minute with a coworker. That detail was what turned my stomach the most. Whoever was following me wasn't guessing. They had been there, every day, every hour. I thought about calling someone, my boss and the police, a friend. But what was I going to say? Someone left a note with my schedule and wrote, "See you soon." It sounded ridiculous, inadequate. I was afraid they'd think I was paranoid, until it was too late. I put the paper in a drawer, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the walls, every engine starting outside, made me think that soon was already arriving. The next day, The paranoia didn't leave me. I parked farther from work, checked around the car before opening it, and even asked a coworker to walk with me to the parking lot when my shift ended. Nothing strange happened, but the weight of that paper stayed in my head. The next night, the parking lot was nearly empty when I finished my shift. I scanned every car, memorizing plates, colors, any detail I might need if something happened. On the third day, I worked up the nerve to take the paper to the local police station. The officer who helped me read it twice, his expression didn't change much, but I noticed small tells, a tight jaw, his eyes locked on the last line. He asked if I'd had any recent conflicts, or if I thought anyone might have a reason to bother me. I said no, and that the shift change detail proved whoever wrote it knew too much. He said they would keep the note on file, but his tone made it clear they wouldn't open an investigation unless something else happened. Weeks passed. There were no more notes, no calls, no signs of being followed. But the fear had already moved in. I jumped every time someone knocked on my door, double-checked phone notifications, changed my route to work. I even stayed with my sister for a few days, just so I could sleep a little. Nothing else happened. It was as if whoever left the note only wanted to leave their shadow inside me, and once fear became part of my everyday life, they disappeared. Even now, I don't know what they wanted. Whether it was a warning, a threat, or just a twisted game from someone who enjoyed watching me lose my calm. Whatever it was, it worked. I never went back to the town fair. And still, every time I walk to my car, I look at the windshield before I open the door. All because of a single sheet of paper, a list of my own movements, ended with a sentence that still haunts me. See you soon. Story 8. Moving to that small town felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone already knew the script, except me. I had just landed a job at a small accounting firm, and the place seemed calm, predictable, easy to settle into. My apartment was right above a bakery that smelled like fresh bread every morning. The pace of life was slower than anything I was used to, and in those first few days, that calm had a certain charm. People said hello on the street, asked where I was from, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. But after barely a week, a strange phrase started repeating itself in almost every conversation I had. The first time I heard it was in a small restaurant near the office. The waitress, an older woman with sharp cheekbones and hair pulled so tight it looked painful, leaned in when I asked her about places worth visiting. She gave a small laugh and said, "Just make sure you don't go past the water tower after dark." I laughed politely, thinking it was some piece of folklore, one of those small-town jokes, like telling outsiders not to whistle at night because it wakes ghosts. I didn't give it much thought. Until 2 days later, my landlord repeated the exact same phrase while fixing a leak under the sink. By the end of the month, I'd heard it at least half a dozen times, from different people: the grocery cashier, a teenager at the gas station, even one of my co-workers. They all said the same thing, in the same words. Some smiled like they were sharing an inside joke. Others said it seriously, without a trace of humor. That repetition unsettled me. I tried to convince myself it was just a local prank, a tradition, an internal reference. But the feeling that the town was testing me, watching how I reacted, began to grow inside me. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. One afternoon, just before sunset, I decided to walk out to the water tower. The structure rose at the edge of town, tall, rusted, with streaks of orange corrosion running down its sides. Around it there was dry grass and a poorly repaired metal fence patched with bits of wire. I stood there staring, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Only the buzz of cicadas filled the silence. Still, on my way back, I noticed people looked at me differently, as if, without knowing it, I'd crossed an invisible line. Their eyes followed me with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. A few days later, I worked up the nerve to ask one of my coworkers, Mark, a quiet guy who always stayed late at the office. I brought it up as a joke, mentioning how weird it was that everyone repeated the same warning. For the first time since I'd met him, Mark stopped dead. He didn't smile, didn't joke. He just said, "There are things that are better left alone." And he walked away without another word. That answer stuck with me. It replayed in my mind every time I passed near the water tower. My curiosity turned into something else, a nearly painful need to understand. One Saturday, I decided to visit the small public library downtown. The building smelled of dust and old carpet, the kind of smell that feels like time itself never dissolves it. I started digging through the local newspaper archives. Nothing. Just stories about school fairs and football games. Not a single mention of the water tower. Until, inside a box labeled miscellaneous, I found photocopies of police reports. The strange part was that none of them had an official stamp or a case number. They described disappearances that happened near the water tower. Locals, travelers, even a door-to-door salesman. The incident stretched across almost 30 years. The wording of every report was too similar, as if they'd been copied from the same template. Some had handwritten notes in the margins. The family insists, last seen near the tower. Patrol reported lights near the structure. They were scribbles, personal reminders, not official documents. My pulse sped up when I realized those reports had never been filed as real cases. It was like I'd found something no one was supposed to see. When I left the library, the town felt different. The streets were emptier, the air heavier, and the water tower, visible from almost anywhere, seemed to be watching me, waiting for me. That night I couldn't sleep. The creaks in my apartment sounded louder, and every time headlights from a passing car lit up my curtains, I expected them to stop in front of my window. That repeated phrase, "Don't go past the water tower after dark," no longer sounded like superstition. It sounded like a warning. The next night I couldn't resist. I drove toward the water tower, this time after dark. The road had barely any lighting. The asphalt was cracked and overgrown with weeds. When I parked near the fence, the air felt thicker, as if silence had weight. I turned off the engine and sat in the car for a moment. The water tower creaked softly in the wind. I thought about the reports, about the people who had vanished. Part of me wanted to leave, but something deeper told me it was already too late to turn back. As I got closer, I noticed marks carved into the fence's metal posts. Initials, dates, rough symbols. Some looked recent, others were eaten away by rust. I put my hand on the cold wire, and for a second I would swear I heard footsteps on gravel, on the far side of the tower. I turned, switched on my flashlight, but I didn't see anything, just grass and dirt. Still, the sound stayed in my ears long after it faded. I drove home trembling, determined to leave the whole thing alone. The next day, I went to the sheriff's office, pretending I was interested in neighborhood safety. The deputy at the counter, a man with tired eyes and a big mustache, watched me closely when I mentioned the water tower. He leaned in and, in a low voice, said, "If you want to keep your job here, don't get involved in things that aren't your business." Then he slid a stack of irrelevant brochures toward me and walked away without saying anything else. That was the only response I got from the authorities. After that, I stopped asking questions. I didn't go back to the water tower. I didn't even drive near it. Still, people kept repeating the same phrase, with the same empty smile. Don't go past the water tower after dark. I learned to nod, to smile, to pretend it didn't affect me. But inside, and I kept carrying the weight of those reports, and the silence wrapped around them. I don't know if those warnings were superstition, habit, or something much darker. I only know one thing. I listened. And maybe that's why I'm still here to tell it.